My cousin called me worthless at his birthday party, the words slicing through the air like shattered glass. What he didn't know was that his insult would trigger a moment that would silence every guest in attendance. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. I stepped into my cousin's sprawling Virginia estate, immediately feeling the weight of wealth pressing down on me. The 40th birthday celebration of the successful business owner resembled something from a Southern Living magazine. Chandeliers casting golden light across the marble foyer, ice sculptures melting slowly on buffet tables, and the distinct feeling that I didn't belong. My simple navy dress stood in stark contrast to the designer gowns and tailored suits surrounding me. 16 years in the army hadn't prepared me for the battlefield of social hierarchy that my cousin had mastered. He stood across the room, holding court with a circle of admirers, his expensive watch catching the light with every animated gesture. "There she is," he called out, his voice carrying that familiar edge I'd grown to dread. "Fashionably late as always." The comment wasn't meant to welcome, but to highlight my perceived failings. I nodded politely, accepting a flute of champagne from a passing waiter. The crystal felt delicate and foreign in my calloused hands. My mother caught my eye from across the room but quickly looked away, her fear of social embarrassment stronger than her maternal instinct to defend. Family members clustered in exclusive circles, their conversations punctuated by polite laughter and the occasional clinking of glasses. The scent of roasted meat mingled with cigar smoke and expensive perfume, creating an atmosphere both inviting and alienating. He just closed another major deal. I overheard my aunt telling someone, her voice swelling with pride. "The business is expanding into 3 more states this year." My father stood alone near a window, looking as out of place as I felt. He offered a small smile when our eyes met, a silent acknowledgement of our shared discomfort in this world of excess. The young waitstaff moved efficiently through the crowd, invisible to most guests except when needed. One of them, barely 20, caught my attention with a respectful nod. Something in his demeanor suggested he saw beyond the superficial glitter of the evening. As the night progressed, I found myself drifting toward the edges of rooms, watching rather than participating. My cousin made his rounds, each interaction seemingly designed to showcase his achievements: the new vacation property, the private school his children attended, the celebrities who frequented his establishments. "You should come by the office sometime," he told a retired businessman, clapping him on the shoulder. "Show you how a real operation works these days." I sipped my champagne slowly, already bracing myself for the inevitable moment when his attention would turn to me. The familiar edge in his smile when he spotted me across the room told me everything I needed to know. Tonight, like always, I would serve as the counterpoint to his success story. The crystal glasses clinked as the servers cleared the final dinner plates. My cousin stood with practiced confidence, his tailored suit catching the light from the chandeliers overhead. A hush fell over the room as he raised his champagne flute, commanding attention with the ease of someone accustomed to being the center of every gathering. "I want to thank everyone for coming tonight," he began, his voice carrying across the dining room of his Virginia mansion. 40 years on this earth, and I've been blessed with success, good friends, and family." A round of approving murmurs rippled through the guests. I shifted uncomfortably in my chair, feeling underdressed in my simple navy outfit among the designer labels that surrounded me. For 16 years, I'd worn a uniform with pride, but here, in this world of social climbing and material wealth, that service seemed invisible. My cousin's eyes scanned the room, pausing briefly on each admiring face before landing on mine. The corner of his mouth curled upward in that familiar way that always preceded something cruel. "You know," he continued, swirling the golden liquid in his glass, "I've been reflecting on life's journeys. Some of us actually made something of ourselves, unlike certain people here who are basically worthless." The words hung in the air for a moment before his gaze locked directly on me. There was no mistaking his target. A wave of laughter rolled through the room, starting with his closest friends and spreading outward like a contagion. My aunt, always the nervous peacekeeper, offered a thin smile while adjusting her necklace. My mother, seated 3 chairs away, suddenly found her dessert plate fascinating, refusing to meet my eyes. The weight of their silence pressed against my chest more painfully than my cousin's words. One of his business associates nodded knowingly, whispering something to the woman beside him. Another raised his glass in mock salute, encouraging the humiliation. I remained perfectly still, my military training the only thing keeping me from visibly reacting. The heat of shame crawled up my neck as I realized the truth. Not a single family member would defend me. Not here, not in front of these people who mattered so much to them. The laughter gradually subsided as my cousin launched into stories about his business triumphs. But the damage was done. In this room full of people, I had never felt more alone. 16 years of service, of sacrifice, of quiet dignity, all dismissed with a single cruel toast and the complicit silence of those who should have known better. I slipped away from the dining room, desperate to escape the lingering echoes of laughter that hung in the air like poison. The balcony door closed behind me with a soft click, sealing off the murmur of conversations that had already moved on to other topics, as if my public humiliation had been nothing more than a passing amusement. The Virginia night embraced me with its thick, humid air. Even in the darkness, beads of sweat formed along my hairline, though I couldn't tell if it was from the summer heat or the burning shame that radiated through my body. I gripped the ornate railing of my cousin's expensive home, feeling the cool metal against my palms as I tried to steady my breathing. Inhale, exhale. The cicadas chirped indifferently in the manicured garden below. This wasn't my first experience with family indifference. Throughout my life, I'd grown accustomed to the subtle dismissals, the conversations that shifted when I approached, the achievements that went unacknowledged. But something about tonight felt different, more deliberate, more cutting. The public nature of it transformed what might have been a private wound into a spectacle. 16 years. I'd given 16 years to the Army, serving with quiet dedication while my cousin built his business empire and his carefully curated social circle. I'd led troops through situations these partygoers couldn't begin to imagine. I'd made life or death decisions while they debated wine pairings and stock portfolios. Yet here, in this world of chandeliers and crystal flutes, my service might as well have been a hobby or worse, a fallback for someone who couldn't succeed in the real world. I stared out at the twinkling lights of distant homes, wondering if those families valued each other more than mine valued me. The worst part wasn't even my cousin's cruelty. It was the silent complicity of my relatives. My mother, who had looked away rather than defend her child. My father, whose silence felt like agreement. My aunt, whose nervous smile had tacitly endorsed the humiliation. A gentle breeze stirred the air, carrying with it the faint sounds of renewed laughter from inside. I closed my eyes, feeling utterly alone despite being surrounded by family. Had my quiet resilience been misread as weakness? Had my refusal to boast about my accomplishments convinced them I had none? In their calculating eyes, was dignity itself a form of failure? I straightened my shoulders out of habit, military posture asserting itself even in my moment of doubt. Whatever they thought of me, I knew my worth. I just wished for once someone in that room did too. I leaned against the balcony railing, letting the humid Virginia night air fill my lungs. The party sounds behind me dulled to a distant hum as I focused on the rhythm of crickets in the garden below. 16 years of military discipline had taught me to compartmentalize pain, but my cousin's words had slipped past those defenses with surgical precision. A soft cough broke my solitude. I turned to find a young waiter hovering uncertainly, empty tray balanced on his fingertips. He couldn't have been more than 20, with a nervous energy that reminded me of new recruits on their first day. "Excuse me," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "I just wanted to say thank you for your service." I straightened instinctively, the response automatic after years in uniform. "You don't need to." "My brother's in the army," he continued, glancing over his shoulder to ensure no one from the party was watching. 3 years now. He's stationed in Germany. The young man shifted his weight, tray tilting slightly. "When I heard what happened in there, what your cousin said, I just thought you should know that someone in this house respects what you've done." His simple words landed with unexpected weight. While my own family sat inside, complicit in my humiliation, this stranger had risked his job to acknowledge my service. "What's your brother's unit?" I asked. His face brightened. "4th Infantry Division. He's a communications specialist." We spoke for several minutes about his brother's deployment, the waiter gradually relaxing as we shared the familiar language of military life, a dialect my wealthy cousin and his friends had never bothered to learn. When his supervisor called from inside, the young man straightened his black vest. "I should get back," he said, then added with quiet conviction, "For what it's worth, sir, my brother says the army taught him what real worth looks like. It's not about money or big houses." After he disappeared back into the glittering party, I remained on the balcony, his words echoing in my mind. The gratitude of this stranger, someone who understood the value of service through his brother's experience, provided an anchor amid the storm of my family's indifference. Inside that mansion, crystal flutes clinked as my relatives laughed at my cousin's jokes, their approval purchased with expensive champagne, and the comfort of shared prejudice. But out here, in a brief exchange with someone who recognized true sacrifice, I found a moment of genuine respect. I straightened my shoulders and smoothed down my simple navy dress. Perhaps dignity wasn't about being valued by everyone, but being truly seen by those who understood what mattered. I returned to the dining room, my shoulders squared, despite the weight of humiliation still pressing down on me. The party had resumed its rhythm, crystal flutes clinking against each other as my cousin's friends laughed a little too loudly. Their eyes followed me as I moved through the crowd, whispers trailing in my wake like smoke. "There's the worthless one," I overheard someone murmur, followed by poorly concealed snickers. My aunt caught my gaze from across the room but quickly looked away, busying herself with rearranging appetizers that didn't need rearranging. My mother stood in a corner, her smile fixed and fragile as she chatted with relatives who had witnessed my public shaming without protest. I reached for my jacket, deciding that dignity required a quiet exit. The weight of 16 years of service seemed to mean nothing in this room of tailored suits and practiced smiles. Just as I turned toward the door, the ambient noise dropped suddenly, like someone had pressed a mute button on the entire gathering. Colonel James Harrison, retired from the Army after 30 years of distinguished service, pushed back his chair at the head table. The movement was deliberate, commanding attention without a word spoken. He was a guest of honor, invited because of his connections to Virginia's most influential families, not because my cousin particularly respected military service. The older man stood tall, his posture revealing decades of discipline. Despite his civilian attire, an impeccably tailored dark suit, he carried himself with unmistakable military bearing. Every eye tracked his movement as he crossed the polished floor, his footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. He stopped directly in front of me, his weathered face unreadable. For a moment we simply regarded each other, two soldiers in a room full of civilians who couldn't possibly understand what that bond meant. Then, with precision that spoke of thousands of similar gestures throughout his career, The colonel raised his right hand in a crisp, formal salute. The sound of his hand meeting his brow cut through the silence like a rifle crack. "Thank you for your service," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the suddenly still room. The gesture was more than respect. It was a rebuke to everyone present who had laughed at my cousin's cruel toast. The colonel held the salute, eyes locked with mine, forcing every person in that room to witness this moment of recognition. My cousin's carefully orchestrated evening of self-aggrandizement had just been completely upended by a simple military gesture that spoke volumes about true worth and respect. The dining room froze in a tableau of stunned faces. The colonel's crisp salute hung in the air between us, his weathered hand steady at his brow. I returned the gesture automatically, muscle memory from 16 years of service taking over before my conscious mind could catch up. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the soft clink of ice in abandoned drinks. Then came the scrape of a chair against hardwood. An elderly gentleman near the window rose shakily to his feet. His wife followed, her pearl necklace catching the chandelier light as she straightened her spine with newfound purpose. Like dominoes falling in slow motion, others began to stand. First the veterans among them, then their spouses, and finally, even those who had been laughing at my expense moments earlier. The cultural gravity of military respect proved stronger than social allegiance. Men in tailored suits and women draped in designer dresses stood at attention, many clearly uncomfortable, but unable to remain seated without marking themselves as disrespectful. The room's energy transformed from smug superiority to uncertain deference. My cousin remained seated, his knuckles white around his champagne flute. The carefully orchestrated atmosphere of his 40th birthday celebration, the one he'd spent months planning to showcase his success, was unraveling before his eyes. His wife shifted uncomfortably beside him, half rising before his hand clamped down on her wrist. "Well," he finally managed, his voice strained as he attempted a dismissive chuckle, "I didn't realize we were at a military parade." His words fell flat in the transformed room. A business associate who had been laughing heartily at his toast minutes earlier now avoided eye contact, suddenly fascinated by the pattern on his plate. The retired colonel lowered his salute but remained standing, his presence commanding respect without a single word spoken. My aunt, always the peacekeeper, fluttered her hands nervously. "Perhaps we should serve dessert," she suggested to no one in particular, her voice unnaturally high. But the damage was done. The invisible social hierarchy had been upended. Guests who had been jockeying for my cousin's approval now looked at me with new eyes, some with genuine respect, others with the dawning realization they'd backed the wrong horse in this family dynamic. As people slowly resumed their seats, the atmosphere remained altered. Conversations resumed in hushed tones, the earlier boisterous laughter replaced by subdued murmurs. My cousin's carefully curated image of success and superiority had cracked, revealing the brittle foundation beneath. In one silent, dignified gesture, the colonel had shifted the balance of power in a way no argument or defense could have achieved. "Just having a bit of fun," my cousin stammered, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow against the sudden silence. His voice, normally confident and commanding, had turned brittle as thin ice. The smirk that had adorned his face moments earlier vanished completely, replaced by an unmistakable flush of embarrassment creeping up his neck and into his cheeks. I watched as the attention of the entire room pivoted away from him and toward me. The guests who had laughed at his cruel toast now shifted uncomfortably in their expensive attire, avoiding eye contact with both of us. Some even murmured quiet apologies as they passed by me to refill their crystal flutes at the bar. My cousin's wife touched his arm gently, perhaps trying to steady him, but he shrugged her off and retreated to a corner with his closest friends. Even from across the room, I could see his animated gestures as he attempted to salvage his wounded pride. "You should just let him have his moment," my aunt whispered, cornering me by the dessert table. "It's his birthday, after all." "We need to maintain family harmony." Her eyes darted nervously around the room as she spoke, more concerned with appearances than with how deeply her nephew had hurt me. "This isn't the place to make a scene about your career choices." Her words deepened my sense of isolation. Even now, with the colonel's gesture forcing everyone to acknowledge my service, my own family was still asking me to shrink myself for the comfort of others. Later that evening, as guests began to depart, my mother pulled me aside. Her face was drawn with conflicting emotions as she admitted what had been weighing on her all night. "I was afraid you would embarrass us by bringing up your army service," she confessed, her voice barely audible. "Your cousin has all these important business connections here, and I didn't want you to seem like you were competing for attention." The words stung more than any stranger's slight possibly could. 16 years of service, of sacrifice, of building a career I was proud of, and my own mother had been embarrassed by it. Not proud, not supportive, embarrassed. I nodded silently, unable to form a response that wouldn't crack with emotion. Across the room, I caught the colonel's eye. He gave me a small, knowing nod, a silent acknowledgement that sometimes the hardest battles aren't fought overseas, but in dining rooms where family should be your strongest allies. The video spread like wildfire through our small Virginia town. Someone had captured the colonel's crisp salute on their smartphone, and by sunrise, it was being shared in group chats and social media feeds across the county. The clip was brief, just 30 seconds, but powerful enough to transform a private humiliation into a public conversation. I first realized the extent of it when my phone began buzzing with notifications. Friends I hadn't spoken to in months sent messages of support. Even my father called, his voice uncharacteristically emotional as he mentioned seeing the video. "I should have stood up for you that night," he said quietly. At the local coffee shop the next morning, conversations hushed when I walked in. The barista, a woman who'd never given me a second glance before, smiled warmly and refused payment for my order. "On the house," she insisted. My brother served too. Meanwhile, my cousin was scrambling to control the narrative. He called family members with his version of events, claiming I had orchestrated the whole thing for attention. "She's always been desperate for sympathy," he told our aunt, who later repeated his words to my mother with concern. His desperation became more evident when he posted a lengthy explanation on his social media accounts, describing the incident as just family teasing that had been blown completely out of proportion. The comment section quickly filled with skepticism. The colonel himself remained dignified in silence, declining interview requests from the local paper. His actions that night spoke volumes without requiring further explanation. By midweek, I encountered the young waiter again at the grocery store. He approached hesitantly, explaining that his manager had reprimanded him for speaking to me at the party. "I might lose my job," he admitted, "but I'd do it again." My brother's been watching that video on repeat. The most surprising shift came from people who had previously dismissed me. A neighbor who had barely acknowledged my existence for years stopped me on the sidewalk to shake my hand. The owner of the hardware store, a friend of my cousin's, awkwardly mentioned his own father's military service when I came in for light bulbs. Even in church that Sunday, the pastor incorporated a message about recognizing the value in others, his eyes finding mine several times during the sermon. My cousin's attempts to paint me as attention-seeking only highlighted his own insecurity. The truth of that moment, captured in 30 seconds of video, carried an authenticity his carefully constructed narrative couldn't match. For the first time in years, I walked through town with my head held high, no longer invisible in my own community. The weeks following the party incident felt like navigating a minefield. Family gatherings, once merely uncomfortable, now crackled with unspoken tension. My Aunt Margaret cornered me at every opportunity, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper as she urged me to let sleeping dogs lie and think about family harmony. Her hands would flutter nervously, as if physically trying to smooth over the ripples in our family's carefully maintained facade. My mother's reaction cut deeper. I caught her eyes darting between me and others at family functions, weighing her loyalty against her lifelong fear of social embarrassment. "I just don't understand why you couldn't keep things private," she said one evening as we washed dishes together. "Military service is admirable, but drawing attention to yourself this way—" Her voice trailed off, leaving the criticism hanging between us like a curtain. The Sunday after Memorial Day, we gathered for the traditional family cookout at my parents' modest backyard. The smell of charcoal and grilled meat filled the air, while conversations flowed in careful streams that deliberately avoided the topic of my cousin's party. I stood by the cooler, nursing a soda and wondering if I should have declined the invitation altogether. That's when I overheard him, one of my cousin's friends who had somehow secured an invitation, loudly joking to a circle of relatives. "I mean, let's be honest, people only join the army when they have no other options, right?" Laughter rippled through the group, though some looked uncomfortable. Before I could react, my father, who had spent most of his life as the quiet observer in family dramas, set down his spatula and walked deliberately toward the group. He wasn't a tall man, but something in his posture commanded attention. "My child," he said, his voice steady but firm, "served this country for 16 years while you were busy following my nephew around like a lost puppy." The yard fell silent. "So I'd appreciate it if you'd show some respect in my home." The friend mumbled an apology and quickly found reason to examine the condiment table. My father simply returned to his grill without another word, but something fundamental had shifted. Cousins who had avoided eye contact for weeks suddenly found reasons to chat with me. An uncle asked thoughtful questions about my service. It wasn't a grand gesture like the colonel's salute, but my father's quiet defense offered something I'd craved far longer. The simple acknowledgement that I belonged, that my choices had value, that family meant standing together even when it wasn't convenient. That evening, as guests departed, my father squeezed my shoulder briefly. No words passed between us, but none were needed. For the first time in years, I felt truly seen by my own family. 2 weeks after the infamous birthday party, I received a message from a mutual acquaintance that caught me by surprise. The young waiter who had approached me on the balcony that night wanted to speak with me. Curious, I agreed to meet him at a local coffee shop downtown. As I waited, nursing a cup of black coffee, I spotted him entering. No longer in his server's uniform, but dressed in jeans and a simple button-down shirt. He introduced himself as Michael, his nervousness evident as he fidgeted with his napkin. "I wanted to thank you properly," he began, his voice gaining confidence. "That night at your cousin's party, seeing how they treated you, it wasn't right." Michael explained that his younger brother had been serving in the army for 3 years. Recently deployed overseas, his brother had been struggling with purpose, questioning whether his sacrifice mattered to anyone back home. "I told him about what happened," Michael continued, "about how that colonel stood up and saluted you, and how everyone had to acknowledge what they'd been ignoring." It changed something for my brother. He pulled out his smartphone and showed me a message from his brother, a photo of him in uniform with a simple text, "Still proud to serve. Tell that veteran thanks." The sincerity in Michael's eyes struck me deeply. While my own family had largely retreated into uncomfortable silence following the incident, this stranger and his brother had found meaning in my humiliation. "My brother said it reminded him why he enlisted in the first place," Michael added. "Not for recognition, but because doing the right thing matters, even when no one sees it." As we talked, I realized this unexpected connection had become an emotional anchor for me. The waiter's gratitude offered something my cousin's cruelty and my family's hesitation couldn't touch: genuine respect that asked nothing in return. In the days that followed, whenever my cousin's friends whispered as I passed, or my aunt suggested I should just let it go, I thought of Michael's brother, finding renewed pride in his service halfway across the world. This small act of reaching out had rippled far beyond that single evening of humiliation. Through their gratitude, I rediscovered my own sense of purpose: to carry myself with the same dignity that had prompted the colonel's salute, regardless of how others might try to diminish me. The worth my cousin couldn't see was visible to those who truly understood service and sacrifice. That recognition, I realized, was worth more than any approval from those who measured value only in wealth and status. 3 weeks after the incident, I received an unexpected phone call. The retired Army colonel, whose salute had changed everything that night, wanted to meet for coffee. My heart raced as I agreed, unsure what to expect. We met at a small cafe downtown, away from prying eyes and gossip. The colonel arrived in civilian clothes but carried himself with unmistakable military bearing. He extended his hand with a warm smile that put me instantly at ease. "I've been following your career for years," he revealed after we settled with our drinks. "Your leadership during the Helmand Province operations was exemplary. The way you handled the evacuation under fire saved countless lives." I nearly choked on my coffee. "You knew about that?" "Of course I did," he replied. "Military circles are smaller than you think. Your reputation for quiet competence preceded you long before we ended up at the same party." The colonel explained that he had recognized me immediately that night. When he overheard my cousin's cruel toast and witnessed the room's reaction, he couldn't stay silent. His salute wasn't impulsive. It was deliberate recognition of service he genuinely respected. "What you did for 16 years matters," he said firmly. "Not just the deployments or medals, but the daily sacrifices most civilians never see or understand." His words washed over me like a healing balm. This wasn't validation born from pity or social obligation. It came from someone who truly understood the weight of the uniform and the cost of wearing it. As our conversation deepened, the colonel shared stories from his own 30-year military career. We laughed over shared experiences and fell silent, acknowledging mutual losses. For the first time since returning to civilian life, I felt truly seen. Before we parted, he placed a hand on my shoulder. "Continue being an example," he urged, "not just for those who already understand service, but especially for those who need to learn what respect actually means." I nodded, feeling a new resolve solidify within me. The colonel's recognition had given me something my family never could: the validation of a peer who measured worth by character rather than status. Walking back to my car afterward, I felt lighter somehow. The sting of my cousin's words hadn't disappeared entirely, but it had diminished against the weight of this new connection. The colonel had offered me something far more valuable than public vindication. He had given me kinship and the quiet certainty that my path had meaning, regardless of who failed to see it. The whispers followed me through town like persistent shadows. Despite Colonel Harrington's recognition, my cousin's version of events spread through Virginia's close-knit community with alarming speed. At the grocery store, conversations would halt when I rounded the corner with my shopping cart. At church, certain families would suddenly find urgent reasons to switch pews. "She's just milking it for attention," my cousin told anyone who would listen. "The colonel was just being polite. You should have seen how she positioned herself right in his path." His business associates nodded along, eager to stay in his good graces. Some townspeople questioned why I hadn't mentioned my military service more prominently before. If she was so proud of her Army career, why keep it quiet until now? They wondered aloud at the coffee shop where I used to enjoy my Saturday mornings. The barista, once friendly, now avoided eye contact when handing over my usual order. My aunt called one evening, her voice tight with forced cheerfulness. "People are talking," she said. "Maybe if you just apologize to him for the misunderstanding, this would all blow over." I remained silent, knowing no apology was warranted for simply existing in the same room as his ego. Yet for every whispered criticism, there emerged unexpected allies. The father of a young soldier stopped me outside the post office to shake my hand. An elderly woman at the pharmacy shared that her late husband had served in Vietnam and understood what it meant to come home to indifference. The young waiter who had thanked me at the party now nodded respectfully whenever our paths crossed. His simple acknowledgement became a touchstone of authenticity amid the swirling rumors. 3 months after the birthday incident, I ran into my cousin's wife at the farmer's market. She approached hesitantly, glancing over her shoulder before speaking. "He's obsessed with discrediting you," she admitted quietly. "It's all he talks about at home." I've never seen him so rattled. I simply nodded, realizing his efforts to diminish me were consuming him, while I was gradually finding peace. That evening, looking at my uniform hanging in the closet, I made a decision. The gossip would continue with or without my participation. What mattered was how I carried myself through it. I would continue showing up at family gatherings with my head held high. I would volunteer at the Veterans Center without fanfare. I would live with the quiet dignity I'd learned during 16 years of service. Let them talk. My worth wasn't determined by their whispers, but by the integrity of my actions. My cousin's empire of arrogance began crumbling within weeks of the birthday incident. 3 of his most lucrative business clients, all veterans with deep community connections, quietly terminated their contracts after the video of the colonel's salute made its rounds. One of them, a retired Marine who owned a chain of local hardware stores, called my father to explain his decision. "I can't do business with someone who treats service members that way," he said. The ripple effect was devastating. My cousin's company, once the crown jewel of his identity, started hemorrhaging contracts. His carefully cultivated reputation as a community leader dissolved as whispers about his behavior spread through Virginia's tight-knit business circles. The financial impact was immediate. He postponed the purchase of a vacation home and canceled the order for his new luxury vehicle. At family gatherings, he arrived with a simmering rage barely contained beneath his designer clothes. The man who once commanded rooms with his booming confidence now slumped in corners, nursing drinks and glaring at anyone who approached. His wife tried to smooth things over, her smile strained as she made excuses for his increasingly erratic behavior. "He's just under a lot of pressure at work," she'd explain, though everyone knew the truth. During a Sunday dinner at my aunt's house, he erupted when someone innocently mentioned an upcoming Veterans Day event. "This whole town has lost its mind," he snapped, slamming his fork down. 16 years mopping floors in the Army, and suddenly everyone acts like it's something special. My aunt attempted to change the subject, but the damage was done. Even relatives who had laughed at his toast months earlier shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Later that evening, I overheard him on the phone in the garden, voice tight with desperation as he tried to convince a former client to reconsider. "This family situation has been blown completely out of proportion," he insisted. "You know how I feel about our troops." The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The man who had built his life on appearances was now watching his carefully constructed facade crumble. Each time he blamed me for his troubles, he only reinforced what others had already concluded. His success had been built on shallow foundations. My father, watching this downward spiral, shook his head one evening after a particularly tense family dinner. "Some lessons come at a high price," he said quietly. Your cousin is learning that respect isn't something you can buy with chandeliers and champagne. As Veterans Day approached, an envelope arrived bearing the town seal, an invitation to speak at the annual ceremony. My hands trembled slightly as I read the formal request. The event committee wanted me to share my 16 years of service experience with the community. Standing before hundreds of people, opening up about my military journey, while the memory of public humiliation still stung, sent waves of anxiety through me. I placed the invitation on my kitchen counter, staring at it for days. The thought of my cousin sitting in the audience, perhaps smirking or whispering to his friends, made my stomach knot. Yet something about this opportunity felt like a turning point, a chance to reclaim my narrative. 3 days after receiving the invitation, my phone rang. Sarah Jenkins, a journalist from the local paper, wanted to interview me before the ceremony. "Your story deserves to be told properly," she said, her voice warm with genuine interest. "Not just what happened at the party, but your 16 years of service. What that means in a world where sacrifice often goes unnoticed." Her words struck a chord. Perhaps my experience could resonate with others who'd been dismissed or belittled. Maybe speaking up wasn't about vindication, but about visibility for all who serve quietly, without fanfare or recognition. That evening, I sat on my balcony, watching the Virginia sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and violet, the same balcony where, months earlier, a young waiter had offered the first genuine thanks I'd received that night. The memory strengthened my resolve. I called the committee chairperson and accepted the invitation. "I'd be honored," I said, surprising myself with the steadiness in my voice. My mother called the next day, having heard about my upcoming speech. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, that familiar note of anxiety creeping in. "Your cousin will likely attend with his business associates." "I know," I replied, "but I'm not speaking for him." The colonel sent a brief text of encouragement when he learned I'd be speaking. "Stand tall. Your words matter." As I drafted notes for my speech that night, I realized I wasn't just addressing the audience or even my dismissive relatives. I was speaking to my younger self, the person who joined the Army with quiet determination, who served with dignity, despite rarely receiving recognition from those whose approval I'd once craved. I knew my cousin would be there, watching. His wife would sit beside him. His business associates would fill a reserved table. But for once, their presence wouldn't diminish mine. This Veterans Day, I would finally claim my voice. The mirror reflected a face I barely recognized. As I rehearsed my speech for the fourth time that evening, dark circles shadowed my eyes, evidence of sleepless nights spent crafting words worthy of the Veterans Day ceremony. My uniform hung nearby, medals catching the dim light of my bedside lamp, silent witnesses to 16 years of service that my cousin had dismissed with a single cruel toast. "Too formal," I muttered, crossing out another line. The blank page stared back accusingly. How could I distill my military experience into something meaningful without sounding either self-pitying or boastful? Each time I closed my eyes, I saw my cousin smirk, heard the ripple of laughter that had followed his worthless comment. The memory still burned, but something had changed. The colonel's salute had sparked a fire that couldn't be extinguished by family judgment or small-town gossip. My smartphone buzzed with a message from my father. "Proud of you. Always have been." His simple words steadied my hand as I continued writing. Dad had finally found his voice at that Sunday cookout, defending me when it mattered. Now I needed to find mine. I pulled out an old deployment journal, thumbing through pages stained with desert dust. Here was the real story. Not medals or ceremonies, but the quiet moments of courage and doubt that had shaped me. The night we'd evacuated a village under fire. The Christmas spent teaching local children to play baseball. the letter I'd written to a fallen comrade's parents, the waiter from my cousin's party. I'd learned his name was Tyler, had texted earlier, "My brother can't wait to hear you speak." His continued support reminded me that this speech wasn't just about personal vindication. It was for everyone who'd ever felt diminished or overlooked. Standing by the window, I watched Virginia's night sky, remembering similar skies in far more dangerous places. I'd faced mortar fire with less anxiety than I felt about speaking before my hometown, knowing my cousin and aunt would be watching, perhaps waiting for me to stumble. My mother had called 3 times with suggestions about keeping things pleasant and not stirring up trouble. Her fear of embarrassment still stung, but I understood now that her anxiety came from love, however misguided. I returned to my notes, finding strength in memories of the colonel's firm handshake and unwavering gaze. "Speak your truth," he'd advised during our last conversation. "Not for those who dismissed you, but for those who need to hear it." By dawn, the speech was finished. 4 pages that traced my journey from enlistment to this unexpected moment of public recognition. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. And for the first time since that humiliating birthday party, I felt not just worthy, but ready. The Veterans Day ceremony hall stood in stark contrast to my cousin's opulent home. American flags lined the stage, their colors vibrant against the wood-paneled walls. Unlike the birthday party's superficial glamour, this gathering carried a weight of genuine respect. Nearly 300 people filled the rows of chairs, their faces turned expectantly toward the podium. I adjusted my uniform one last time in the small preparation room. My fingers traced the medals that represented 16 years of service, each one earned through sweat, sacrifice, and determination. The bronze and silver felt cool against my fingertips, grounding me in this moment of truth. 5 minutes, the event coordinator whispered, clipboard in hand. Taking a deep breath, I stepped into the hallway and caught sight of my parents in the front row. My father sat tall, his posture betraying a pride he rarely expressed in words. Beside him, my mother clutched her purse nervously, her eyes darting between me and the other attendees. Several rows back, I spotted my cousin, arms folded tightly across his chest, his wife fidgeting uncomfortably beside him. The mayor finished her introduction, and suddenly, it was my turn. Walking to the podium felt like crossing a battlefield, each step deliberate, measured, conscious. My polished shoes echoed against the hardwood floor as I approached the microphone. The silence in the room was profound. No clinking champagne flutes, no whispered judgments, no forced laughter, just respectful attention. The retired colonel nodded slightly from his seat of honor, his presence a silent affirmation of why I stood there. "Thank you for this honor," I began, my voice steadier than I'd expected. The words I'd rehearsed for days flowed naturally now, stories of camaraderie and service replacing the prepared speech I'd written. As I spoke about the meaning of sacrifice and the quiet dignity of duty, I noticed several veterans in the audience nodding in recognition. Their understanding eyes reflected experiences no civilian could fully comprehend, the brotherhood and sisterhood forged in circumstances my cousin could never imagine. The young waiter who had thanked me months ago stood at the back of the hall, having traded his server's uniform for casual clothes. He smiled encouragingly when our eyes met. For 16 minutes, one for each year of service, I shared not just my military journey, but the deeper lessons of worth that transcended any single person's judgment. The audience leaned forward, collectively holding their breath during descriptions of difficult deployments, and exhaling with relieved laughter at moments of unexpected humanity found in harsh conditions. This wasn't the validation I had once craved from family gatherings. It was something far more substantial, recognition built on truth rather than appearance, on substance rather than show. The last words of my speech hung in the air as I stepped back from the podium, my heart pounding beneath my pressed uniform. Mayor Wilson approached, her face solemn yet warm as she took my place at the microphone. "Today," she announced, "we honor not just service, but character." She lifted a polished wooden plaque, its brass plate catching the light. "For 16 years of distinguished military service and exemplary leadership both on and off the battlefield, we present this community award." The silence that followed felt eternal. Then, a single pair of hands began to clap, hesitant at first, like raindrops before a storm. I looked down to see my father rising from his seat in the front row, his weathered hands moving with deliberate purpose. Beside him, my mother stood, tears streaming unchecked down her face, her fingers trembling as she joined the applause. One by one, they rose. Aunts, uncles, cousins, neighbors. People who had witnessed my humiliation months ago, now standing in recognition. The sound swelled, filling the hall with a thunderous affirmation that seemed to shake the very foundations of my doubt. From my vantage point on stage, I could see the colonel, ramrod straight in his dress, uniform, nodding with quiet approval. The young waiter who had thanked me at the party stood near the back, beaming alongside his brother in uniform. Even my aunt, who had once urged silence for the sake of family harmony, was on her feet, her eyes meeting mine with a mixture of apology and pride. The mayor pressed the award into my hands, its weight substantial and real. Unlike the hollow validation I'd once craved from my cousin, this recognition felt earned, forged through years of service rather than purchased with wealth or status. I scanned the crowd, overwhelmed by the sea of faces. Some were strangers, others familiar from a lifetime in this Virginia town. My mother dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, while my father stood tall, his chest visibly expanded with pride. This was the moment I had needed without knowing it. Not just applause, but acknowledgement of my worth from the very people whose silence had once cut deepest. The standing ovation continued, washing over me in waves. After years of quiet service and months of painful doubt, the validation I had sought wasn't coming from a crystal champagne flute or tailored suit. It came instead from this honest recognition. A community finally seeing what the colonel had recognized that night at the party. That worth isn't declared by those who have the loudest voice, but proven by those with the strongest character. The thunderous applause continued to fill the hall as everyone stood in recognition of my service. Everyone except my cousin. While the entire audience rose to their feet, he remained firmly planted in his seat, arms crossed tightly over his chest. His jaw clenched so hard I could see the muscle twitching even from the stage. Next to him, his wife dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. She had always been kind to me in private, though never openly contradicting her husband. Today was different. As emotion overcame her, she slowly stood, her shoulders shaking slightly as tears streamed down her face. The contrast couldn't have been more stark, her genuine emotion against his rigid defiance. I caught the colonel's eye across the room. He gave me a subtle nod, his expression conveying what we both understood. This moment represented more than just an award ceremony. This was a public reckoning. For years, my cousin had built his identity around being the successful one, the achiever, the one who made something of himself. He had carefully constructed a narrative where military service was somehow less valuable than his business ventures. Now that carefully crafted illusion was crumbling before everyone's eyes. My aunt leaned over to whisper something to him, likely encouraging him to stand, but he shook his head sharply. His refusal only highlighted his pettiness. Several of his business associates, the same ones who had laughed at his cruel toast months ago, now looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats as they realized they'd aligned themselves with the wrong side of history. The mayor approached the microphone again as the applause finally subsided. "This is what real achievement looks like," he said, gesturing toward me. Though he didn't mention my cousin by name, the implication hung in the air. Several heads turned toward my cousin, whose face had flushed deep red. My father caught my eye from the front row, standing tall with unmistakable pride. My mother, who had once feared I would embarrass the family, now wiped tears from her cheeks, her earlier concerns transformed into visible admiration. In that moment, I realized the community's respect had become a mirror, reflecting back to my cousin the smallness of his spite and the hollowness of his supposed superiority. His attempts to diminish me had only revealed his own insecurity. As I stepped down from the stage, people reached out to shake my hand. The same people who had witnessed my humiliation at the birthday party now looked at me with newfound respect. My cousin remained seated, isolated in a sea of standing supporters, finally understanding what true worthlessness felt like. The journalist's article appeared in the local paper first, then spread like wildfire across social media platforms. Within days, my story had traveled far beyond our Virginia town, reaching military communities nationwide. The piece detailed both the humiliation at my cousin's birthday and the powerful moment when the retired Army colonel stood to salute me, framing it as a testament to the quiet dignity that defines true service. My smartphone buzzed constantly with notifications. Messages poured in from veterans who had faced similar dismissal from civilians who couldn't comprehend their sacrifices. "Your story is my story," wrote a former Marine from Texas. Others came from parents who shared the article with their children as a lesson in respect and resilience. Each message reinforced what the colonel had tried to show that night, that worth isn't measured by wealth or social standing, but by character and contribution. The local coffee shops, once breeding grounds for gossip about my supposed failures, now fell silent when I entered. Those same people who had laughed along with my cousin now approached with handshakes and awkward apologies. "We didn't understand," they'd say, eyes downcast. I accepted their words without bitterness, recognizing that growth often begins with discomfort. My father called one evening, his voice thick with emotion. "People stop me at church now," he said. "They tell me how proud I must be." After a pause, he added, "I've always been proud, but I should have said it louder." His words healed wounds I hadn't realized were still open. Even my aunt, who had urged silence for the sake of family harmony, sent a handwritten note acknowledging her mistake. "You showed us all what dignity looks like," she wrote. "I'm sorry I asked you to dim your light." Perhaps most surprisingly, several of my cousin's business associates reached out privately, seeking my perspective on leadership and integrity. One confided, "I've worked with him for years, but never felt comfortable with how he treats people. Seeing you stand tall changed something for me. My reputation had transformed, not as someone seeking pity, but as a person who embodied resilience when faced with cruelty." The community that had once been complicit in my humiliation now looked to me as an example. Veterans organizations invited me to speak at their events. The local high school asked me to mentor students interested in military service. Through it all, I maintained the same quiet strength that had carried me through 16 years in the Army. I hadn't sought fame or vindication, but in standing firm in my worth, I had become something I never expected. A mirror, reflecting back to others the power of dignity in a world too often seduced by shallow success. 9 months after that humiliating birthday party, I stood on the balcony of the town hall, the same cool Virginia air washing over me that had once been my only comfort. The Veterans Day ceremony had just concluded, and the weight that had pressed on my shoulders for so long had finally lifted. Inside, people still mingled, many stopping to shake my hand or offer congratulations. The community awards sat in my car, not displayed like a trophy, but tucked away like the quiet pride I'd always carried. My father had insisted on driving me home later, his eyes bright with an emotion I'd rarely seen him express. My cousin had left immediately after the ceremony, his wife apologizing in his absence. She'd whispered that he was working through things, but we both knew the truth. His business was struggling, now that several veteran clients had taken their accounts elsewhere. The empire built on appearances was crumbling under the weight of revealed character. The colonel had become a mentor of sorts, inviting me to speak at veterans events across the state. "You represent something people need to see," he told me last week over coffee. "Strength without arrogance, service without expectation." My mother had finally found her voice, too. At Sunday dinner last month, when a distant relative made a dismissive comment about military service, she'd set down her fork with surprising force. "My child served this country for 16 years, she'd said, her voice steady. "That deserves respect, not commentary." The young waiter, Daniel, I'd learned, had enrolled in college using his GI Bill benefits after his own service. He'd sent me a card thanking me for standing tall when it would have been easier to shrink. His words meant more than any medal. As I gazed out at the town lights, I realized my journey had never been about winning my cousin's approval or even proving him wrong. It had been about finding the courage to stand in my truth when others tried to diminish it. The validation I'd sought for so long had come, not from family applause or social media shares, but from the quiet recognition that my worth had never depended on their acknowledgement. It had been there all along, in every mission completed, every soldier supported, every day I'd chosen duty over ego. I took one last deep breath of the night air and turned to rejoin the celebration. The path forward was clear now, not defined by old wounds or family expectations, but by the steady compass of my own hard-won self-respect.